Hey everybody, I've been having a conversation the past day or so about this idea of basically to curve it or not to curve it. That's kind of what I'm going to call it, right? So, and the idea being that I've heard this before and I've been thinking about this subject for a super long time. I mean, seriously, I've thought about this subject for the past probably, I don't know, 7, 8 years, something like that. Like even when I was working with TrackMan, I would definitely hear this idea that if you had path too close to zero, that it was hard to control your ball flight. And then there were some next steps. They would take it even further. People would, instructors, tour pros, golfers, etc., would take it even further and say that it's harder to control your face when the path is, um, really neutral, as in kind of zero-ish, right? So, um, yeah, I think even when I was with TrackMan, one of the I can't remember who, but somebody did a thesis or their like TrackMan master on this exact subject. Like, hey, if you get amateur golfers to swing inside out 4 or 5 degrees, then that gives you kind of more room to fit the face in between there and the target, and somehow they end up hitting the ball um, with less dispersion, is the general idea, right? And it makes sense to me on the surface for sure. Like, hey, why would I want to try to start the ball or swing right at the target, excuse me, if I know that face is harder to control than path, and face pretty much starts the ball, then logically speaking, that ball is going to start away from the target and curve away from the target a lot, right? And so, like, as a player, that makes total sense to me. I definitely don't think I would really like too much seeing the ball start away from the target and curve away from the target very much, right? Like if I was playing good golf, and I think about the times when I'm playing good golf or have played good golf, which is few and far between these days, but I definitely don't feel like I remember, hitting my start line, not hitting my start line and curving it away from my start line, right? To a big degree. So as a player, I totally understand it, that idea and that logic. But everything I've read scientifically, and I've talked about this subject a lot. It doesn't seem to hold up, right? I really haven't seen any data suggesting that if we swing towards the target, um, that we're going to have a harder time controlling our dispersion, right? So first thing I wanted to pull up here, I couldn't find all the pictures from this, but this is a presentation that the guys at Ping did. I think this was Eric Hendrickson. This was during Andrew Rice's coach camp. If you haven't checked that out, please do. This year was virtual. It was super cool. But this is just one of the slides that I kind of got from it. And they took their kind of simulation or model data, right? They have all these thousands of shots that they've tracked and how the ball performs, all these kind of things. And they've taken this model and basically asked this question. Okay, so this is a driver swing, or excuse me, these are all drivers. So a little different than what I just did anecdotally, kind of testing it. But basically, what they said, and I can't remember the exact numbers here, they had two scenarios. Player A was swinging with a neutral path, a zero path, and trying to hit the ball as straight as possible. And they had plus or minus 2 degrees in face variation, right? So the path could be zero and the face could be +2 or -2. So two to the right or two to the left, and kind of what that would do to the shots, the dispersion, all of that. The second scenario was if you had a player swinging in to out 4 degrees, and you had the face always fitting between the target line and the path, right? So in other words, that face is anywhere from 4 degrees to the right to 0 degrees. What that shot dispersion would look like. Okay, so this is with the driver, and as you can see here, just a couple little things. The stat area for the ones that are curving is a little bit smaller, which is interesting to me. I would not have expected that necessarily. It is a little bit smaller though. However, with the driver, you're definitely going to lose distance, right? The reason for that is because there is more spin loft, right? So when you have face to path up to 4 degrees, when you're curving the ball, even though that face, if we can magically say that it fits between 0 and 4, which, newsflash, I don't think that happens very much, your spin loft is going to be greater, right? Spin loft determines ball speed, spin, launch, those kind of things, obviously. So does attack angle, club speed, things like that. But if you take all the other factors out, spin loft is going to determine how fast that ball is coming off the face, how much spin it's going to have to it, and of course, how far it's going to end up going, right? All other things the same. So the greater the spin loft, the shorter the distance, okay? So gaining 3.7% in accuracy, I guess is the lack of a better term. I'm probably not saying that right, but losing 11 yards in distance, and therefore the straight shots were 0.45 strokes better. So in other words, yeah, maybe you hit a little straighter, but you're definitely going to lose distance, and it's probably not worth it if you do that. Okay, so my question is, that is great for there. My question is more related towards irons, and I think the part that people forget a lot when talking irons is we're only thinking left and right in the dispersion area, and we're not necessarily thinking front to back. So if we take that same scenario and say that we have 3 players, all the same player, swinging 3 different ways. One is swinging with 0 path, one is swinging with 4 degrees to the right path, and one is swinging with 4 degrees to the left path. And on the 0 path, we're trying to keep the face between plus or minus 2, right? So 2 right or 2 left. And the 4 right path, we're just trying to keep the face between 4 and 0. And the 4 left path, we're trying to keep the face between 4 left or -4 and 0. Okay, so what would that kind of do to that dispersion? So again, you're going to run into the same issues as kind of the driver swing. What I would expect to see, what makes sense to me, because the spin loft is greater and more variable on the shots where you're trying to curve it. Again, so that spin loft could be up to the face to path difference is going to affect the spin loft a bit, because that face to path is up to 4 degrees versus the straight shots. The face to path is only plus or minus 2, right? So that 2 degrees of difference more on the curving shots should affect the spin loft more, and you should see dispersion front to back more. Okay. All right. So anyway, so I decided to go into TrackMan just real quick. I've done this several times, and by no means am I saying take anything from this, but it's kind of interesting, right? I decided to hit some 7 irons. I warmed up, all that jazz, and I set up a test in TrackMan because that's going to quantify a target out there. So not just hitting shots that based on left or right data, but also front to back dispersion as well. And so basically I had 3 different targets. 190, that's kind of like my stock 7 iron distance. So that was my straight shot. I tend to hit the draw a little further, so I chose 192, and I tend to hit the fade a little shorter, so I chose 186. That seemed to make sense to me in my mind. Don't know if that makes sense to everybody else. But just kind of looking at it, it's interesting. So this was the fade one. Pretty good, right? Like all these shots, I hit 10 shots each. All of them were pretty darn good. I was indoors, like perfect alignment every time, hitting off of a mat. So keep all that in mind. Hitting 10 shots in a row. I would love to be able to do it where I go back and forth from hitting different shots, but the way the TrackMan Test Center kind of works, it doesn't allow you to do that. You got to hit 10 in a row in order for them to show up in groups like this all together, and that's what I wanted to accomplish. So, on the surface, don't really see too much difference. Maybe that little draw on the purple one is a draw on the 192 is maybe a little bigger size to the circle. The straight one kind of looks a little smaller, but I don't really notice too much of difference in those. When you start kind of drilling down into the data, so these were the fade swings here. There's a 186. I chunked this one. I chunked this first one here. So that may throw it off a little bit, but just kind of showing you there, I did hit behind it a little bit. So some of the numbers that I'm kind of looking at with the fade, my front to back dispersion. So if I take kind of these away real quick, right there, So I think the shortest one was 179.6, and the longest one was 191.8. So about 11 and a half yards or 35 feet dispersion front to back, right? The side to side, I think I had one, that first one 36 feet right, it looks like, and 17 feet left. So that equals about 55 feet-ish or so side to side, that dispersion. Yeah, so there we go. So pretty good shots, I would imagine. I don't really know how good that is. And you can see my average here. Path was averaging 4, face was averaging 2, right? So we're pretty much fitting in that scenario. All of every single one of my shots, the face was in between, barely, in between the target and the path, okay? So that was kind of the fade swings. That was the last group, actually, that I hit. The first group that I hit was actually the straight shots. Don't know if that means anything. And here's that one. So front to back on the straight shots, I had 12.9 yards front to back, so about 39 feet, I believe. We can look at that. Yeah, so it was like the shortest one was, let's see here, 182, and the longest one was 194 or something like that. I believe that's the numbers there. And then the side, I had about 45 feet difference in the side. So, like a little bit better. So you can see my average from pen was 15 feet. The average from pen on the fade shots, I believe, was like 16 feet or something like that, 16 and a half feet, right? So, like a little better, not too much better. I can't really say anything there. The draw swings, which, full disclosure, my draw is probably my natural kind of shape to the ball. I hit it fairly straight, but I would say draw is kind of like a little more default comfortable. I can't hit them where they go quite a bit left, and you'll probably see a couple of these. I did that. I definitely didn't average as good from the pin, probably because I was trying to exaggerate the draw a little bit to get the path 4 out. Typically, if I'm hitting a nice solid draw, I'm not going to swing more than like 2 degrees right with a 7-iron. So, again in here, I hit a couple that weren't great. I think this one I kind of chunked to this 74 score one. So it wasn't that great, but this one was definitely the least consistent one for whatever reason. So like some of the consistency numbers that you're trying to look at here, I'm looking at. So like path on this one, 0.8 consistency, face angle 1.3 consistency. That was on the draw. Path 0.9 and 0.8, so obviously more consistent. Face angle on the fade swing 1.1, path 1.3. So again, straight shots, for whatever reason, in one little test, my path in my face was definitely more consistent with the straight shots, right? So yeah, doesn't mean that much because it's one shot or one little test, but I thought it was kind of interesting. I'd be curious to see other data like this from super high level players that are better than me, that aren't going to hit chunks in there. That's for sure. But yeah, I think it's odd to me, right, to tell someone, especially amateurs, that they need to swing away from the target to be a better golfer. That's a hard one for me. 2 reasons. Path does help start the golf ball. I know we all say, hey, face starts it, which generally speaking, rule of thumb, it's going to start at anywhere from 75% for iron, mid irons to 90% for a driver. If you're getting in a short game, bunker shots, it can go all the way down to 60%, right? So path, 25 to up to 40% with wedge shots, little pitch shots, stuff like that. The path can start the ball, up to 40% towards the path. But most of the time, probably in that 25 to 10% range, right? So if that's the case, why would I want to tell an amateur golfer who already struggles with starting the ball on target to swing further away from the target, i.e. start the ball further away from the target? That part is really, really hard for me. Tour pros, maybe. Maybe. I've definitely seen tour pros when I worked for TrackMan, was on tour. I mean, most tour pros on a stock shot weren't more than 2, maybe 3 degrees left or right of target with an iron. Driver, maybe a little more. I could see that, right? Like I could see them moving it maybe a little more with the driver. I did see a player that shot 59 on tour with his 7 iron. He was like 12 out. Face was at 4, and he was hitting it on the heel and just hitting like a 15-yard draw. But he shot 59 on tour, so I'm not going to question him. That's for sure. But, interesting conversation. Would love to hear everybody's thoughts further on this. I do give some credence, or I have a theory of fade swings that maybe can be more consistent or easily controlled. The face can maybe be more easily controlled through fade swings. And the idea there being that we know that rate of closure on draw swings is higher than on fade swings, or maybe I should say fade swings have a lower rate of closure. So I could get behind the idea that it's easier to slow something down than to speed it up. Like mechanically speaking, it makes sense to me if something's really rotating super, super fast and I just add a little bit of force to it or a little bit of closing force to it, that would be a harder dial to control. That would like be a more sensitive dial to control versus slowing it down. Almost think about like pedals on a bike, right? Like if they're going really, really fast, it's way easier to just slightly slow it down than to add speed to it. It's like harder to control. I don't know if that makes any sense, but anyway, thought that was a decent kind of analogy for it. So I could see potentially, and I think there's been some negative gamma talk about that, right? Like twist about the shaft where, hey, maybe there's something to that potentially. And I think in some hack motion data and stuff like that, you kind of see certain players like a Victor Hovland or somebody like that where they're having really low handle twist numbers. Whole nother conversation about what's measuring it and all that jazz, but interesting, right? So something to think about. But yeah, just want to share my thoughts. Sorry it was longer than it probably should have been, but I definitely thought that was worth going through. Thanks.